So this is the second video for endocrine system, and it's going to talk, instead of talking about specific hormones so much, it's going to talk more about how the hormones actually, how the whole system actually works. So there's 5 major steps in how a hormone works. Okay, so the first one is synthesis. Okay, so the hormone has to be made somewhere. This looks kind of funky because when I import it from PowerPoint into my iPad, it always changes the format a little bit. So the first step is synthesis. So synthesis of this hormone. So how is the hormone made? And then we're going to talk a little bit about the chemistry of the hormone. Okay, then the stimulus that's going to release the hormone we'll talk about. Okay, so what's going to cause it to be released, how it gets transported in the blood. Okay, the fourth step is that it has to bind to a receptor. So where is the receptor at? And then we're going to talk about how how cellular changes occur. Okay, so let's just walk through this. Okay, so hormone secretion is controlled one of 3 ways. So there's 3 different ways it can be controlled. So one is neural. So neurons can come in and they're going to stimulate the gland. 2 examples of that are the posterior pituitary and the adrenal cortex. So they both have neurons that are going to release neurotransmitters, and that's going to tell the gland to release its hormones. Okay. The next one is really, really common, and that's hormonal. So one hormone triggers the release of another hormone, and a good example of that is the hypothalamus controlling the anterior pituitary. And then the third one is humoral, and humoral is fluid. Okay, so humor and fluid kind of mean the same thing. So humor is where a hormone, what triggers the hormone to be released is the amount of a substance or a solute in the blood, or in a humor, okay, in a fluid. So an example would be blood glucose. Okay, so the difference in blood glucose is going to control whether insulin or glucagon are released. Okay, now hormone chemistry. Okay, so there's 3 classes, chemical classes of hormones. Okay, and I want you to know this in general, and I want you to be familiar with some examples of them. Okay, so steroids, right, are formed from cholesterol. Okay, and steroids always have this you typically have a 4-ring structure. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Steroids are definitely secreted by the gonads, okay, and the adrenal glands. So usually you're looking for O and E at the end. Okay, so let me turn this around. No, I kind of have, I don't know what I did. Okay. I don't know. Okay, so you're looking for O and E at the end of it. So aldosterone, testosterone, progesterone. Okay, estrogen is a steroid. Cortisol is a steroid. Okay, so those are examples. So that you're looking for the O and E at the end. That's one way you can recognize it. You're going to know what comes from the gonads and what comes from the adrenal glands. So that will kind of help. Remember, steroids are lipids, okay, because cholesterol. So that means that they're not water soluble. Okay, so not water soluble. So that means they're going to act a little different in the blood. Okay, now peptides and glycoproteins. Okay, so they're chains of amino acids. So they're coming from the pituitary and the hypothalamus, or examples of them. So here's some chains. They also come from the pancreas. So oxytocin, antidiuretic hormone, insulin, those are all examples of peptides. The things that come from the hypothalamus and things that come from the pituitary are also peptides. Okay, so peptides are proteins. So that means they're going to be water soluble, so they can dissolve in water. Okay, so they can float in your blood freely. Okay, then the third type are called monoamines or biogenic amines, and they come from amino acids, so they're much simpler compounds. They just have like one or two rings. So if you remember, amino acids have the NCC, that's what you're looking for. So, okay, so they're coming from the adrenal gland, the pineal gland, some things from the thyroid gland, okay, like thyroid hormone. Okay, so thyroid hormone has thyroid, and it's got iodines on it, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so three types, three classifications that I want you to be familiar with. Okay, so here's how they're made, and I'm not too worried that you can go through this pathway. I just kind of want you to see. Okay, so if we have cholesterol, right, we have these four rings. Those four rings get modified to form these steroids. Cholesterol is essential, right? You can't get rid of it or you're not going to have these hormones. Okay, insulin, what happens with it, the way that it's made is there's pro-insulin, and it's a longer peptide, and it gets cut to become proinsulin, and then that gets cut again, and that's where we get insulin from. You don't have to know the pathways. I just want you to recognize they're chains of amino acids. Okay, and then monoamines, one example is melatonin, and it's actually made from the amino acid tryptophan. Other monoamines are made from tyrosine. Okay, so thyroid hormone is two tyrosines put together. And you don't have to know necessarily how they're made, the biochemical pathways, but I want you to understand what they are and how they're different from each other. Okay, when we talk about hormone transport, so what I want you to remember, okay, is the plasma membrane hydrophobic or hydrophilic, and is blood hydrophobic or hydrophilic? Okay, so if you think about the plasma membrane, right, and we have these phospholipid bilayer, most of it is hydrophobic. Okay, so the majority of it's hydrophobic. Okay, and blood is going to be hydrophilic. Okay, so lipid-soluble hormones, when we transport them in the blood, they have to bind to a carrier. Okay, so they have to have, I always call it like a little life raft. So the lipids don't want to be in the blood. They don't want to free float in the blood because they're hydrophobic. So they're bound to a protein carrier to get transported in the blood. Okay, but when they get to the cell, they can they can bind to a cellular receptor, and they could actually go through the membrane, through the cell membrane. I'm looking for my notes. Okay, if it's bound to a receptor or to a carrier, it also prolongs the half-life, so it can exist longer. Okay, then we're going to talk about binding to the receptors and cell changes. Okay, so here's examples of two different kinds of proteins. Okay, so this is I think a pretty simple diagram, I hope. Okay, so here's blood, right? Here's blood. There is a pointer. Let me try to find the pointer. Let's see if I can get it to work. Okay, so here's blood. Okay, here's the tissue fluid. Here's cell. Okay, and here's the nucleus. So out here we have some hormones, so free hormones, and then we have some that are bound to proteins. Okay, so if they're bound to proteins, that means that they're hydrophobic. Okay, so the hydrophobic have to be bound. Here, this is like really dorky. There's lightsabers here. You want to see the lightsaber? Okay, so the hydrophobic hormones, okay, they're going to get released, right? And they can actually pass through the plasma membrane, and they're going to go through the nuclear membrane, and they bind to a receptor in the nucleus, and then they can cause a change. Okay, so even though they can't float freely in the blood, they're able to pass through the cell wall or cell membrane. and the nuclear membrane, and they cause a change to occur in the cell. Okay, now if we look at hydrophilic hormones, okay, so these are hormones that can free float in the blood. When they get to the cell, okay, because they're hydrophilic, they can't pass through the cell wall. So they bind to a receptor on the cell membrane. I keep saying cell wall, cell membrane. Okay, and they activate a second messenger system. That second messenger system is going to cause the change to occur in the cell. Okay, so those are the two differences. Okay, so let me walk through that again. So if you're hydrophilic hormone, you can float in the blood, okay, freely. Then you get to the cell membrane and you have to bind to a receptor. You can't enter the cell. Okay, and we activate a second messenger system. Okay, if you're hydrophobic, you're bound to a protein in the blood, but you can enter the plasma membrane, the nuclear membrane, and cause a change within the cell. Okay, so thyroid hormone is an example. So if we look at thyroid hormone, okay, so it's bound to a carrier in the blood because it's a monoamine. Okay, so it's bound here. Okay, then it can pass through. All right, and then it'll go into the nucleus and it'll interact with the DNA and it'll trigger cellular changes like increasing aerobic respiration. So there's mitochondria, and then it can increase protein synthesis. Okay, so it speeds up your metabolism. Went too far. Okay, now second messengers. How do second messengers work? Okay, so what happens is the hormone will bind to the receptor in the plasma membrane. Okay, and it's going to cause a chain of things to occur. Okay, so it'll activate a G protein. Okay, and the G protein will then activate this adenylate cyclase, which will produce cyclic AMP, and that'll activate different protein kinases, which will activate enzymes, and that'll cause reactions to occur. So cyclic AMP, or CAMP, this is cyclic AMP, is CAMP. It's a second messenger. So basically, when a hormone can't enter the cell, it's got to get the message in some way. So I kind of think of like, if you, this is probably silly, but if you go to a bar and you can't get in, right? You don't have your ID and you can't get in. So you have to give the message to somebody at the door, and then they can deliver it all the way through until the person that you need the message to get to makes the change. And they say, oh, well, she can't go in here. She doesn't have her ID, so we got to go someplace else. Okay, so it's just like a chain event of reactions that are going to communicate within the cell because this hormone can't get inside the cell, can't enter the cell. Okay, so cyclic AMP is an example of a second messenger. Whoops, wait a minute. Too far. Okay, so enzyme amplification. So it's important to realize with things like these biochemical pathways that it just takes a small stimulus to cause the hormone to be released. Okay, and then it gets amplified as we get cyclic AMP and protein kinase, and then we get activated enzymes, and then we get a bigger, broader effect. So it's just that it's spreading. Okay, so it's like a pyramid. Oops, Okay, so if we do lipid soluble and water soluble and fill out my little table, things to remember. Okay, so lipid soluble, they're going to be made from cholesterol. Okay, water soluble, they'll be made from amino acids. Okay, lipid soluble has to have a carrier. I can't get my stylus to write. They have to have a carrier. I can't find the better stylus. Carrier. These guys can float in the blood. Okay, these guys can enter the plasma membrane, and then they cause they go to the DNA, and they cause the cellular response to occur. Okay, the water-soluble ones, they have to bind to the receptor on the plasma membrane. Okay, and then the change occurs. So a second messenger has to cause the change to occur. Okay, so how do we get rid of hormones? So in order for us to get rid of hormones, you don't want them in there stimulating things all the time. So the hormone signal has to be turned off. Okay, and then the liver and the kidneys actually clear or break down the hormones, and the hormones get secreted or excreted in bile or urine, so they end up in your urine or your feces. The metabolic clearance rate is how fast your liver, your kidneys, sometimes the target cells get rid of it too, how fast they're getting rid of it. And half-life is the time to clear half or 50% of a hormone. Okay, so we can also modulate the sensitivity of target cells. Our body does this. So we have upregulation and downregulation. Upregulation is if we add receptors. So if you look here, we don't have many receptors. And then maybe when you're getting to puberty, okay, you end up having more receptors for testosterone. Okay, so you develop more receptors and you can become more sensitive to the hormone. Okay, downregulation means that we're reducing how many receptors we have. Okay, so how the cells respond depend on how much hormone we have, okay, how many receptors we have, and sometimes we have interactions between the hormones. Okay, so hormone interactions are things like the first one I have is synergistic effects. So if we have something that's synergistic, the hormones are working together. So, for example, in sperm production, testosterone and follicle stimulating hormone both have to be there in order for sperm to be produced in enough numbers and be viable. Okay, permissive means one hormone enhances the response to the second one. So the example I have here is oxytocin has to have prolactin in order for milk to be made. So the one doesn't work without the other one. Okay, and then estrogen gets the uterus ready for progesterone for pregnancy. Okay, and then the third interaction is antagonistic effects, so that's opposite. So the best example of that is insulin and glucagon. Okay, so peregrine secretions, these are secretions that hormones or messengers diffuse short distances and they stimulate cells nearby. So they're considered local. So some examples, and we usually talk about these more when we get to the systems. Histamine is released from mast cells and it makes blood vessels leaky. Okay, nitric oxide causes blood vessels to dilate. Somatostatin controls alpha and beta cells. And then catecholamines like epinephrine and norepinephrine diffuse, they move from the medulla to the cortex. Okay, so the idea is we're not dumping things into the blood, they're diffusing through the tissue. Okay, and they're regulating other cells. That's really, I just want you to know basic for that. Okay, now if we talk about endocrine disorders, so things that can cause disorders are how much hormone you have, if you have too much or you have too little, whether your receptors are working. Okay, and then we have hyposecretion. Okay, so the hormone's not being secreted. Okay, and it's not getting to the target cells, or hypersecretion of a hormone. Poop. So if we go here, so hypersecretion of growth hormones, so acromegaly, and I have heard other people say it prettier than I say it. This is hypersecretion of growth hormone in adults. So what happens when you're adult and you have that? Your bones get thicker. So things get thicker and stubbier, like her cheekbones and her jawbone are thicker, her hands are thicker. Okay, so you're growing, but you're not growing up and down, you're growing wider. Okay, so another example would be before the growth plates are closed, if you have hypersecretion of growth hormone, you could have gigantism, so you make a giant, and there's some pictures in your book, some stories. And then hyposecretion would be dwarfism, so they don't have enough. But there's different kinds of dwarfism. You didn't hear me say that. Okay, so there are thyroid gland disorders. There's a lot of those. Okay, so congenital hypothyroidism, it means, right, you have a decrease in thyroid hormone. So it happens in congenital, so that means you're born with it. So in infants, so lots of times they have thickened facial features, their body temperature is low, they're lethargic, and it can lead to brain damage. Okay, so that needs to be addressed right away. Myxedema is adult hypothyroidism. Okay, I don't know why my little arrows don't come out. But this leads to low metabolic rate, lethargy, weight gain, blood pressure can go up, they can get edema. Okay, now goiter. Okay, and I have a picture. Goiter is due to dietary iodine deficiency. Okay, so you need iodine. Okay, iodine is a component of thyroid hormone. So T3 has 3 iodine molecules, T4 has 4. Okay, if you don't have any iodine, you can't make thyroid hormone. So what happens is the negative feedback loop gets messed up. So you're supposed to have, right, thyroid releasing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and then thyroid hormone. Well, what happens is, okay, you can't make this. So you can't make thyroid hormone, so you don't have any of that. So this is not feeding back to here. But this thyroid stimulating hormone, your anterior pituitary, thinks that it needs to keeps trying to make thyroid hormone. Okay, so it keeps pushing and making this to try to make this, and then the thyroid ends up really, really enlarged. So this number goes up. The thyroid stimulating hormone goes up. So thyroid gets bigger and people get a goiter. Okay, now, toxic goiter is also called Graves' disease. And in Graves' disease, okay, it's an autoimmune disease. So your body makes antibodies that look like thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, so thyroid stimulating hormone will then increase the amount of thyroid hormone you have. Okay, and that's going to speed up your metabolism. Okay, this is the one with exophthalmos, so this is with the bulging eyeballs. Okay, and then there's going to be a bunch of other symptoms. So what they'll try to do is they'll try to get rid of the antibodies. I think. So there's a goiter. That's an endemic goiter. Okay, so there's the goiter. Okay, hypoparathyroid. So if you don't have any parathyroid glands, if they're not working at all, the calcium levels in your blood are going to drop drastically, and it leads to an electrolyte imbalance. If you don't have any calcium, it leads to tetanus, so your muscles contract and don't relax, and it can lead to death in 3 to 4 days. Okay, now hyperparathyroidism causes excess parathyroid hormone secretion. Okay, so we end up with too much calcium in our blood. Okay, so sometimes we lose it from our bone. Okay, and this can cause kidney stones. It can cause a lot of different problems. Okay, adrenal disorders. Okay, so Cushing's syndrome is the first one I have on here. So what happens with it is the adrenal cortex is producing too much cortisol. So people will get a bump on their back and then a really round, they call it a moon face from having lots of fat being deposited. So sometimes it happens if you get too much ACTH from the pituitary. Okay, and then adrenogenital syndrome is AGS. So with it we have androgen hypersecretion. So what happens with it is females have too many, they end up with too many male hormones being released from the adrenal cortex. So the females end up looking like males. Okay, now diabetes mellitus. Okay, so diabetes mellitus. So in general with diabetes, what we're going to see, okay, so if we have hyposecretion of insulin, okay, so if we don't have enough insulin, we have polyuria, which is excessive urine. Okay, we have polydipsia, which is excessive thirst, and polyphagia, which is excessive hunger. Okay, so what will happen is the glucose is not getting picked up and put into the cells or stored. So we end up with hyperglycemia, which is an increase in blood sugar, right? Blood glucose. Glucoseuria is glucose in the urine. And then ketonuria is ketones in your urine. Okay, so what can happen is you are not able to absorb glucose, fatty acid metabolism gets messed up, and protein metabolism gets messed up. Okay, so all of those are disrupted if the insulin levels are too low. So fatty acids, when they get broken down, they can turn into ketones, and ketones will make you more acidic. What happens is the transport maximum of the glucose that gets reabsorbed by our kidneys. How do we end up with glucose in our urine? Is the transport maximum gets messed up. Okay, so let me erase that. Try to explain it. No, I think this is the eraser. No. Is that the eraser? Nope. Yeah, there it is. Okay. Sorry, hold on. Okay, so when the glucose is in our blood, okay, it actually passes through into our urine. Okay, so it's starting to go into our urine, or our glomerular filtrate, what's going to become our urine. Normally what we do is we can reabsorb the glucose and put it back from our urine back into the blood. So normally, okay, so the glucose is getting filtered out. It actually gets filtered out. It can end up in your urine, but our body is really good at reabsorbing it, so we pick it back up. Well, what happens when you have too much glucose in here, you exceed the transport maximum of reabsorption. So you've filled up all the little protein channels that are supposed to reabsorb it. So there's no place else for the glucose to go. So it ends up getting peed out. So our body's really designed not to do that, right? Because glucose is gold. Glucose is what we use to make ATP. So we want to hang on to it as much as we can. But if there's too much in our blood, because it's not getting picked up by our cells, it's going to overflow into the urine. Okay, and that's glucoseuria. Okay, so when we change the amount of glucose in there, water's going to follow, and that's going to give us excess urination too. Okay, now there's two types of diabetes. Well, there's more than two types, but two basic types to start out with. Okay, so type 1 and type 2. So type 1 is insulin dependent diabetes mellitus. Okay, so insulin dependent. So only 10% of the cases are this. They used to call this juvenile diabetes. So what happens with this is the beta cells in your pancreas aren't producing insulin. So no insulin. Okay, so this is one that's genetic, you're born with it, or it's an autoimmune disease, they're not quite sure. Okay, now type 2, this is the 90%, and it's really epidemic in the United States. It's bad. They used to call it adult onset, but it's not just adults, right? So with it, what we have is we have non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus. Okay, so what happens is the target cells don't respond to the insulin. So something's wrong with the receptors. Okay, so we kind of break the receptors by eating too much sugar, and there's genetic. Okay, so 3 major risk factors for type 2: heredity, okay, your age, the older you get, and obesity. Okay, so the target cells don't respond to the insulin. So something's broken with the receptors. Your pancreas is still making it, but it can't pick it up. Okay, now there's other kinds. There's a couple other kinds of diabetes, and I don't have them in here, but so these are the 2 main ones for right now. Okay, now, why is diabetes so bad? Okay, so when the cells can't absorb glucose, okay, they're going to rely on fat and protein. So they used to call, in the old days, they called it chronic wasting disease. So no matter what people with diabetes, like type 1 diabetes did, they couldn't put any weight on. So they just couldn't store any glucose. So they got weight loss and weakness. Chronic pathology, what happens is being hyperglycemic all the time. The glucose is actually toxic to neurons. So it damages neurons, it damages arteries. So neuropathy damages the nerves, and then people can't feel what's going on in their extremities, and they end up with infection. So it just kind of, it's bad. We need to take care of ourselves. Okay, so that's the last slide.